Chapter 12. The Wolves. For a time during the day, Taryn believed they had at last outdistanced the cauldron-born, but late that afternoon, the warriors reappeared from behind a distant fringe of trees. Against the westering sun, the long shadows of the horsemen reached across the hill slope toward the flatlands where the small troop struggled onward. "We must stand against them sooner or later," Taryn said, wiping his forehead. "Let it be now. There can be no victory over the cauldron-born, but with luck we can hold them off a little while. If Eilenwy and Gurgi can escape, there is still a chance." Gurgi, draped over Melangar's saddle, immediately set up a great outcry. "No, no! Faithful Gurgi stays with mighty lord who spared his poor tender head. Happy, grateful Gurgi will fight too, with slashings and gashings." "We appreciate your sentiments," said Fluter, "but with that leg of yours, you're hardly slashing or gashing anything at all." "I'm not going to run either," Eilenwy put in. "I'm tired of running and having my face scratched and my robe torn, all on account of these stupid warriors." She jumped lightly from the saddle and snatched a bow and a handful of arrows from Taryn's pack. "Eilenwy, stop!" Taryn cried. "These are deathless men. They cannot be killed." Although encumbered by the long sword hanging from her shoulder, Eilenwy ran faster than Taryn. By the time he caught up with her, she had climbed a hillock and was stringing the bow. The cauldron-born galloped across the plain. The sun glinted on their drawn swords. Taryn seized the girl by the waist and tried to pull her away. He received a sharp kick in the shins. "Must you always interfere with everything?" Eilenwy asked indignantly. Before Taryn could reach for her again, she held an arrow toward the sun and murmured a strange phrase. She knocked the arrow and loosed it in the direction of the cauldron-born. The shaft arched upward and almost disappeared against the bright rays. Open-mouthed, Taryn watched while the shaft began its descent. As the arrow plummeted to earth, long silvery streamers sprang from its feathers. In an instant, a huge spiderweb glittered in the air and drifted slowly toward the horseman. Fluter, who had run up just then, stopped in amazement. "Great Bellin!" he exclaimed. "What's that? Looks like decorations for a feast!" The web slowly settled over the cauldron-born, but the pallid warriors paid it no heed. They spurred their mounts onwards. The strands of the web broke and melted away. Eilenwy clapped a hand to her mouth. "It didn't work," she cried, almost in tears. "The way Akron does it just makes it into a big sticky rope. What's all gone wrong? I tried to listen behind the door when she was practicing, but I've missed something important." She stamped her foot and turned away. "Take her from here!" Taryn called to the bard. He unsheathed his sword and faced the cauldron-born. Within moments they would be upon him. But even as he braced himself for their onslaught, he saw the horsemen falter. The cauldron-born reined up suddenly, then, without a gesture, turned their horses and rode silently back toward the hills. "It worked! It worked after all!" cried the astonished Fluter. Eilenwy shook her head. "No," she said with discouragement. "Something turned them away, but I'm afraid it wasn't my spell." She unstrung the bow and picked up the arrow she had dropped. "I think I know what it was," Taryn said. "They were returning to Aeron. Gwydion told me they could not stay long from Annavin. Their power must have been waning ever since we left Spiral Castle, and they reached the limit of their strength right here." "I hope they don't have enough left to get back to Annavin," Eilenwy said. "I hope they fall into pieces or shrivel up like bats." "I doubt they will," Taryn said, watching the horsemen slowly disappear over the ridge. "They must know how long they can stay and how far they can go and still return to their master." He gave Eilenwy an admiring glance. "It doesn't matter, they're gone. And that was one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. Gwydion had a mesh of grass that burst into flame, but I've never seen anyone else who could make a web like that." Eilenwy looked at him in surprise. Her cheeks blushed brighter than the sunset. "Why, Taryn of Caer Dallben," she said, "I think that's the first polite thing you've said to me." Then suddenly Eilenwy tossed her head and sniffed. "Of course. I should have known it was the spiderweb. You were more interested in that. You didn't care whether I was in danger." She strode haughtily back to Gurgi and Melangar. "But that's not true," Taryn called. I was..." By then, Eilenwy was out of earshot. Crestfallen, Taryn followed her. "You can't make sense out of that girl," he said to the bard. "Can you?" "Never mind," the Fluter said. "We aren't really expected to." That night, they continued to take turns at standing guard, though much of their fear had lifted since the cauldron-born had vanished. Taryn was the last watch before dawn, and he was awake well before Eilenwy's had ended. "You'd better sleep," Taryn told her. "I'll finish the watch for you." "I'm perfectly capable to do it on my own," said Eilenwy, who had not stopped being irritated at him since this afternoon. Taryn knew better than to insist. He picked up his bow and quiver of arrows, stood near the dark trunk of an oak, and looked out across the moon-silvered meadow. Nearby, Fluter snored heartily. Gurgi, whose leg had shown no improvement, stirred restlessly and whimpered in his sleep. "You know," Taryn began with embarrassed hesitation, "but Spiderweb, I don't want to hear any more about it," retorted Islandwy. "No, what I meant was, I really was worried about you, but the web surprised me so much I forgot to mention it. It was courageous of you to stand up against the Cauldron warriors. I just wanted to tell you that." "You took long enough getting around to it," said Islandwy, a tone of satisfaction in her voice, "but I imagine assistant pig keepers tend to be slower than what you might expect. It probably comes from the kind of work they do. Don't misunderstand, I think it's awfully important, only it's the sort of thing you don't often need to be quick about." "At first," Taryn went on, "I thought I would be able to reach Caradathel by myself. I see now I wouldn't have even gotten this far without help. It is a good destiny that brings me such brave companions." "There! You've done it again!" Islandwy cried, so heatedly that Fluter choked on one of his snores. "That's all you care about! Someone to help you carry spears and swords and what all. It could be anybody, you'd be just as pleased. Taryn of Garrett-Alban, I'm not speaking to you any more." "At home," Taryn said to himself, for Islandwy had hardly pulled a cloak over her head and was feigning sleep, "nothing ever happened. Now everything happens, but somehow I can never seem to make it come out right." With a sigh, he held his bow ready and began his turn at guard. Daylight was long in coming. In the morning, Taryn saw Gurgi's leg was much worse, and he left the campsite to search the woods for healing plants, glad that Cole had taught him the properties of herbs. He made a poultice and set it on Gurgi's wound. Fluter, meanwhile, had begun drawing new maps with his dagger. The Cauldron warriors, explained to the bard, had forced the companions too deeply into the Estrad Valley. Returning to their original path would cost them at least 2 days of hard travel. "Since we're this far," Fluter went on, "we might as well just cross Estrad and follow along the hills, staying out of sight of the hunt of the Horned King. We'll be only a few days from Caradathel, and if we keep a good pace, we should reach it just in time." Taryn agreed to the new plan. It would, he realized, be more difficult, but he judged Melangar could still carry the unfortunate Gurgi as long as the companions shared the burden of the weapons. Islandwy, having forgotten she was not speaking to Taryn, again insisted on walking. A day's march brought them to the banks of the Estrad. Taryn stole cautiously ahead, looking down the broad valley. He saw a moving dust cloud. When he hurried back and reported this to Fluter, the bard clapped him on the shoulder. "We're ahead of them," he said. "That is excellent news. I was afraid they'd be much closer to us and we'd have to wait for nightfall to cross Estrad. We've saved half a day. Hurry now, and we'll be down to the foothills of the Eagle Mountains before sundown." With his precious harp held above his head, Fluter plunged into the river, and the others followed. Here, Estrad ran shallow, scarcely above Islandwy's waist, and the companions forded it with little difficulty. Nevertheless, they emerged cold and dripping, and the setting sun neither dried nor warmed them. Leaving the Estrad behind, the companions climbed slopes deeper and rockier than any they had traveled before. Perhaps it was only his imagination, but the air of the land around Spiral Castle had seemed to Taryn heavy and oppressive. Approaching the Eagle Mountains, Taryn felt his burden lighten as he inhaled the dry, spicy scent of pine. He had planned to continue the march throughout most of the night, but Gurgi's condition had worsened, obliging Taryn to call a halt. Despite the herbs, Gurgi's leg was badly inflamed, and he shivered with fever. He looked thin and sad. The suggestion of crunchings and munchings could not rouse him. Even Melangar showed concern. As Gurgi lay with his eyes half closed, his parched lips tight against his teeth, the white mare nuzzled him delicately, whinnying and blowing out her breath anxiously, as if attempting to comfort him any way she could. Taryn risked lighting a small fire. He and Fluter stretched Gurgi out beside it, while Islandwy held up the suffering creature's head and gave him a drink from the leather flask. Taryn and the bard moved a little away and spoke quietly between themselves. "I have done all I know," Taryn said. "If there's anything else, it lies beyond my skill." He shook his head sorrowfully. "He has failed badly today, and there is so little of him left I believe I could pick him up with one hand." "Caradathel is not far away," said Fluter, "but our friend, I fear, may not live to see it." That night, wolves howled in the darkness beyond the fire. All next day, the wolves followed them, sometimes silently, sometimes lurking, barking as if to signal one another. They remained always out of bowshot, but Taryn caught sight of the lean gray shapes flickering in and out of the scrubby trees. "As long as they don't come any closer," he said to the bard, "we needn't worry about them." "Oh, they won't attack us," Fluter answered. "Not now, at any rate. They can be infuriatingly patient if they know someone's wounded." He turned an anxious glance toward Gurgi. For them, it's just a matter of waiting. Well, I must say, you're a cheerful one, remarked Islandwy. You sound as if we all had to look forward to being gobbled up. If they attack, we shall stand them off, Terran said quietly. Gurgi was willing to give up his life for us. I can do no less for him. Above all, we must not lose heart so close to the end of our journey. The Flam never loses heart, cried the bard. Come, wolves, or what have you. Nevertheless, uneasiness settled over the companions as the gray shapes continued trailing them, and Mellingar, docile and obedient until now, turned skittish. The golden-maned horse tossed her head and rolled her eyes at every attempt to lead her. To make matters worse, Fluter declared their progress through the hills was too slow. If we go any farther east, said the bard, we'll run into some really high mountains. The condition we're in, we couldn't possibly climb them. But here, we're practically walled in. Every path has led us roundabout. The cliffs there, he went on, pointing toward the towering mass of rock to his left, are too rugged to get over. I thought we'd find a pass before now. Well, that's the way of it. Can only keep on bearing north as much as possible. The wolves don't seem to have any trouble finding their way, said Islandwy. My dear girl, answered the bard with some indignation, if I were able to run on 4 legs and sniff my dinner from a mile away, I doubt I'd have any difficulties either. Islandwy giggled. I'd love to see you try, she said. We do have someone who can run on 4 legs, Terran said suddenly. Mellingar. If anyone can find their way to Cairdathel, she can. The bard snapped his fingers. That's it, he cried. Every horse knows its way home. It's worth trying, and we can't be worse off than we are now. For an assistant pig keeper, said Islandwy to Terran, you do come up with some interesting ideas now and then. When the companions started off again, Terran dropped the bridle and gave Mellingar her head. With the half-conscious Gurgi bound to her saddle, the white horse trotted swiftly ahead at a determined gait. By mid-afternoon, Mellingar discovered one pass, which Fluter admitted he himself would have overlooked. As the day wore on, Mellingar led them swiftly through rocky defiles to high ridges. It was all the companions could do to keep up with her. When she cantered into a long ravine, Terran lost sight of her for a moment and hurried forward in time to glimpse the mare as she turned sharply around an outcropping of white stone. Calling the bard and Islandwy to follow quickly, Terran ran on ahead. He stopped suddenly. To his left, on a high shelf of rock, crouched an enormous wolf with golden eyes and lolling red tongue. Before Terran could draw his sword, the lean animal sprang.